And we've got two fantastic women who are going to be talking about this issue today. Joanna Bryson is the Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School of Governance. She's based in Berlin. And Dorothy Gordon, who is the Chair, Board Member of the World Summit Awards. But as she said earlier, there's plenty of other accolades that you could put to her name. So welcome, Joanna. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thanks. I didn't know if I could talk. Oh, we're not. Oh, there. Now we're equals. And now we're pointing at each other. Okay, even better. Great, guys. So I'm thrilled, and I'm already talking first. So I guess I'm showing my northern privilege here. We're supposed to be peers. How do we make ourselves more peers?
Well, I think by not focusing too much on it, let's see how the conversation flows. We are looking at the geopolitics of this. You come from a part of the world that people are seeing as increasingly dangerous because of the level of control that non-state actors have on our digital lives. So perhaps from the point of view of that part of the world, do you perceive people as having issues with that, or they're comfortable with it?
You know, to be honest, I don't know which part of the world you're talking about, because we're all afraid of non-state actors. They're just different non-state actors that we're worried about, I think. And actually, we're also afraid of some of the state actors that, like SolarWinds was a state actor. So yeah. I barely know.
It's your turn to ask a question, Joanna. I mean,
right.
I've
well,
heard you. Yeah.
One of the things I have to admit, okay, so speaking again about entitlement, I used to say in Britain all the time, Google we, because I knew, I don't know, hundreds of people that got either went directly to work for Google or were bought by Google. And and suddenly someone in a little pub in the middle of Wales said, "What are you talking about? Those guys are aliens from another continent. They're really far away. They're all male. They're all white." The truth is that quite a lot of people from all over the world, if they're good and they climb, there are people from around the world. So I sometimes feel like people are making invisible the massive amount of migration that has gone to California. But at the same time, what is your perception?
I have had the privilege of visiting Google headquarters. And in my view, I did not see many people from my continent of Africa there. I didn't even see many African Americans. And what's recently been in the news, we see that people who have been working on ethical AI within Google have been, I cannot comment on it, I don't know enough, but let's just say they don't work there anymore. Yeah. So when you walk around, you see that a lot of talent has been recruited from Asia. And I think when we're looking at the geopolitics of this whole area, the ethics of it, we see that we can't think in the old terms of West developing, less developed. We see that Asia is definitely rising. But if we just look at it, I would like us to look at it, first of all, from the policy level. Who is engaging? And we see that in Europe, there's considerable engagement, not only at the EU level, but even at the national level. You see that people are concerned about these issues, but we don't see that necessarily in all the other parts of the world. So you could say that, yes, there are a lot of engineers that come from certain parts of Asia, but how far some of these issues are being debated within Asia, which of course is such a vast, continent, just like Africa is. We can't really generalize, but we can say that I think that we can definitely say that we need more engagement. We need more engagement even in Europe, and we need more engagement even in the US. I can't comment much on China. Yeah,
no, we need more diverse engagement from the US for sure. I think Europe is getting better. I do think it's doing some leadership here, also in terms of the numbers of PhDs and and also social mobility. I don't know enough about what's going on in Africa in terms of social mobility. I know that at Hertie School we have a small number of students from Africa and more applying, and we're looking for more funding. I assume that it's like that around most of Europe, but I don't know. I've only been to a few universities here. But is what I guess I would like to see people, both people that are getting out and into these companies, but also people starting companies where they are, right? But I was just really angry because Eric Schmidt was saying, why don't you guys regulate your own AI? And I was like, it is our AI. There's loads of Europeans that certainly go to California.
Yes.
So could you say anything about, do you know about barriers? You're saying that the problem for selling software that's developed in Africa is people say, oh, you don't have adequate defenses against non-state actors that might be invading your cybersecurity?
No, I think it's more complicated than that.
That's pretty
complicated. In Africa, the government is the main procurer of goods and services. And you see there is a rapid digitalization happening. And you can be sure that there are a lot of AI products that have been designed externally that are being used in Africa. And we cannot be sure of what databases that they are using to help develop those products. Definitely, we do not have legislation in place at this time that would support procurement on the basis of transparent audit of that data and the design of the algorithms and the necessity for diversity on the programming teams. We don't have that in place yet. This is something that it's just recently coming out in the European Union. So what is going to happen is that, or what I would presume on the basis of history, is depending on where funding is coming from, you will see an inclination to purchase from that particular geography. So that means that it's that much more difficult for a respected African company to actually get that contract. And what happens is the big companies get the contract and then they subcontract to the African company so that you're getting like 10% of the contract value, but you're doing most of the work. Of course, I'm speaking in extremes here for the purpose of communicating an idea. It's not always that bad. But what we also see is a lot of attention being given to startups, not enough attention being given to scale-ups. And I think in general, we don't have coherent policy when it comes to actually saying that we want to build capacity at a regional level. Even within Europe, I was quite amazed to see. Let me say, first of all, that I'm very impressed with the strides that Europe is making at the moment in terms of, policy recommendations that are starting to come out, the negotiations starting to go on. But when I have interacted with individuals who are working in the field of AI, I still see a lot of nationalistic sentiment, and we don't have enough collaboration at the business level between various countries. It's still seen as either the firm or else it's at the EU level. That's where we're collaborating. And you can imagine with the sophistication of the European market, that would be far easier than what would happen in other markets where you don't have the depth in terms of the scientific personnel that are necessary. But what I would say, and I was linking into that earlier when I talked about people engaging with this in different regions, is in Europe, what we see, and we do see that in the US as well, is a realization that this is not just a technical area. This is an area that requires sociologists, it requires ethicists, it requires people who are specialists in the area of inclusivity to get involved with the analysis and in charting the way forward. I like the theme of this conference because it's asking us what we want to see in the next 10 years. You know, so I think that one of the things that I definitely want to see is that we have a more general awareness of the multi-sectoral, the multidisciplinary nature of the challenges that are facing us, and our lack of understanding of the impact on our societies as we stand here right now. So we have to really up our game, as it were.
Okay, I'm going to throw, that was super fascinating. So I'm going to throw you two, you may remind me of two anecdotes. I'm going to throw both of them at you and then ask you to sort of comment on them. One was that, speaking of business, I got talked into, really, they spent years. They finally got me to go to this tiny town. Well, it's not that tiny, really. I just didn't know, called Cluj in Romania. And it turns out that they have this weird cycle where people, like in New York City or someplace, scrape together $30,000. Then they go to Cluj, and that money goes a long way. And they develop their prototype. Then when they need to get, like put together, you know, a 10-person company or something, they move to Berlin. Why? Because of the amount of corruption in Romania. They don't want to deal with it. So they get to a certain scale, they go to Berlin, they're there for 2 or 3 years, and then they're trying to get to California so that they can like cash in ka-ching, right, and get this huge amount of money. So Berlin is trying to catch them here. they're not trying so much. Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's a cycle at all like that, if you've heard anything about that in Africa and those kinds of concerns. But I appreciate what you said. It took Europe a long time to put together the union, the trade union they have here. So that brings the second side. The second story I wanted to say was that I was at the last meeting, no, second to last meeting I went before COVID. I was in Brussels, and somebody was pitching to, somebody from Europe was pitching to African Union people and saying, look, if you need something fast, like the Ebola thing, go to China. They are super fast. But if you want a long-term solution that's going to last because it's going to benefit your people, come to us. The EU is really good at those kinds of long things. We understand we're slow. It's because we're diverse, but we're good at thinking in the long terms. Since I've heard that, and I've seen a couple other papers too, I've realized that Africa could be like the EU on steroids. It's got even more diversity. It's going to take even longer to figure out all the deals. But it could then be like an even better source of stability or innovation. And in fact, one of the places that's already happening is in the UN Security Council. They seem to be better able to negotiate and coordinate around that than other continents, partly because they have to figure out ways to do this kind of coordination. So those are the two.
I think you're making a lot of interesting points. First of all, I'm not sure I would agree with the analysis of EU versus China. You know, I think that Africa has recognized that it will have to evaluate any partnerships on, like everyone does, in terms of their interests. And the EU will not do itself any favors by being slow. They have to become a little bit more agile. But one of the things that could be done is building in better the kind of capacity transfer and handover that we don't see consistently in these kind of procurements. Because I speak a lot about techno-colonialism or techno-imperialism, where you see that gradually your autonomy is completely eroded because all your critical national infrastructure is actually controlled by external parties. And you have no say in how those deals are being run. It's something of great concern to us. And I believe, you know, we are a huge continent. We are going to be the largest continent in terms of population in just a few more years. We have so many countries, and there's a great diversity of development in those countries. There are huge cultural differences within 2 kilometers of each other that we have to take into account when we are building our national agenda. So to be able to understand Africa adequately enough to develop solutions for this continent, it's very clear that there has to be a better kind of partnership. There has to be a better kind of deal. So this is where we need to be thinking, and we need to figure, what are we going to do with this huge mass of African youth that are coming onto the job market? And within the continent, we have to think about how we can train. And I am somebody who really believes that we can deliberately encourage more women into tech, for example. And so if I look at the next 10 years, I want to see that we have a better balance when it comes to women. I want to see a better balance when it comes to people of color. I don't know if we're getting any reactions from the audience, whether anybody wants to comment.
We'll get that in 8 minutes. So then we'll have
okay.
the last 10 minutes is entirely Q&A with the audience. So audience, if you're thinking things, start typing, that's okay. Hopefully it'll all come to us.
Okay.
If I can come back into what you just said though, one of the things that was, this is sort of maybe it's a weird tangent, but I was a programmer in the 1980s and I loved it. It was a great job. And the numbers of women were going up then. When I was there, it was about 12% of programmers were women. It peaked at 17% and then it plummeted. And and this is in the US, I was shocked. I did a 2017 paper in Science that showed that, about that AI is exactly as racist and sexist as the average American, that when it's trained off of the language from the internet. And at the implicit level, not the explicit level of implicit biases are carried in our language. But anyway, one of the things I was horrified by was finding out that there's only 4% of programmers now are women in the United States. So that's a third as many as when I was there. And I wondered if part of the problem was actually open plan offices, just being the harassment, sometimes it is, I don't know, the conflicts that happen there. But yeah, no, this problem, even what I wrote down when you said about how do we, what do we do with the youth? I want the youth to be able to do something with themselves, right? It's how can we, and I'm really, what was really striking about what you just said was this thing about the loss of infrastructure. And I want to, if you don't mind, I'll come back to that. We feel like we're losing the infrastructure too. The digital is changing the balance of power between corporations and governments. So I think that is a challenge that maybe unites us. And again, maybe Africa will come up with a better solution in the meantime. What do you think about like the Chinese approach, about sort of making a wall and say, okay, let's figure out our own economy first and then go to the rest of the world?
Well, let's be honest, it's worked for them. It's worked for them. They are now a global tech power. And probably they would not have been if they had adopted a different approach. I always prefer to steer clear of places that I'm not an expert on. I don't know enough, but looking at it from the outside, and as I said, like every group of people within Africa, we will look at our own interests, what makes sense. And I can tell you that the government of China invests huge amounts in training Africans every year. There are huge amounts of scholarships. I remember one young lady from where I used to be the director general came to see me, and she said she's off to China to study aeronautical no, was it space engineering or something? So many engineers. So there are many old ways that people have established to build friendship. But I think that what we need to focus on is concretely, how do we change our future in such a way that some of those power imbalances get fixed, and I think that you can't do it without the involvement of the companies. And what we've seen is antitrust legislation in the US had not kicked in the way some US legislators are looking at it today. And so before we had a lot of siphoning of smaller companies, and that is what has helped create that situation. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that on the other side of the world, we see the same things happening. And so if we correct in one area of the world and the other area of the world continues unabated, that's not going to help solve our problem. So we've got to figure out substantively how we are going to do this. And I believe that the UN has got a huge role to play. We are always looking at rules-based versus diplomacy. And I think in this area, we've got to have, yes, it's good to establish legal frameworks, but if we're going to work in a truly transboundary and international way, I think the UN has a huge role to play here.
I think that's right, and I think I'll come back and ask you a question about that, but now I'm going to take another turn on talking because you brought up antitrust, and it happens I've been working with someone from the Director General of Competition here in the EU. We taught a course about this, which means I listened to her. Just like I'm trying to listen to you now. I'm not great at it, but I'm doing some effort. Anyway, the point is that I did learn some, and what it is that the antitrust was sort of invented, the whole idea, because there was this democracy that was only a century old, had just suffered enormous civil war, huge proportion of the population had been killed. And then they noticed that there seemed to be these individuals that had too much power that they weren't sure a democracy could actually get on top of them. So the original goal of antitrust was keeping a company small enough and individuals poor enough that they could still be governed by a democracy. And unfortunately, that has been eroded, especially since, again, the plateauing of the Soviet economy and then, of course, its subsequent dismantling. And I think that people were wrong to do that. They thought that the threat was the communism, the dangerous ideas of Marx, and that was embodied in the Soviet Union. And no, I think that what we found now is that inequality is a threat, that when you have radical inequality, too few people have enough power to create real mayhem, and then you wind up with warfare, instability, destruction, even of the infrastructure that's propping up those small numbers of people. So it's in their own interest to give up some of that power and try to stabilize things. And I don't can solve this, huh?
Well, you sound as if you've been, how can I say, imbibed some of the socialist values of your current location.
Well, I didn't say we're only socialists here. That is the same thing in China. They found a mixed model that works there. But the point was that right now the G7, that's exactly two socialists, just talked about raising the minimum amount of tax per company and a country, and that's been part of the issue with the transnational avoidance of tax.
Yes, I think you need to refresh. You are coming out a little garbled, but it's a very complicated kind of discussion to have, but definitely the reasoning behind antitrust and the situation that we find ourselves in today. I always like to quote the person who said that when it comes to tech, it's a little bit like the Wild West, but instead of pulling the gun, you pull out the algorithm, and nobody, It's the law of the stronger algorithm kind of thing. If we go back to Europe, I think that Europe is giving us quite a bit of leadership at the moment when we look at the instruments that are being negotiated. But also, Europe has come out with its policy of strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy in other language could be seen as slightly protectionist, and I'm calling on my diplomatic training in choosing my words, but it's sending a clear message to everyone that we have to look at our own interests, and we have to be conscious of the fact that you cannot give up control of your government and your critical national infrastructure to external parties, where you may not be able to actually do any verification as to whether or not they are complying with some of the parameters that you've set for the engagement. So it's something I would like you to comment on. Are you happy being strategically autonomous?
Yeah, there was an interesting question about this, just with respect again to COVID and vaccines. I think you're right in your assessment of what people are saying, and I think there are people I would not want to side with who are talking about this, and there's other people that I wouldn't mind as much siding with. So I do think you need to have your own face mask on, oxygen mask on, before you can help children, because otherwise you're unconscious and they can't help. But that's the airplane metaphor from back when we used to fly around. So I get that you have to be able to take care of yourself, but there's some other things that actually it makes no sense at all. So I was worried for a long time about the fact that Europe didn't make its own chips. But then I was told that you can't actually make chips without a global supply chain, because there's rare earths and various things. And so basically, if you can't buy chips, you probably can't buy the components of chips either. So sometimes we really are truly transnationally interdependent. But in other things, it may make sense just for global robustness that we do have sort of smaller, more local loops. But I don't think it makes sense for, like a little tiny country to just say, I'll do everything internally, in-house. Then you really will get out-competed.
Yeah, but I do think that even within Europe, you're not trying to do that. You're working at the level of the EU to have that kind of strategic autonomy. It does send a message to other regions as to what they should be doing.
Yeah, and I do think that everybody should be looking at the example of the EU in terms of that we could be making a powerful club too. If we can find ways to harmonize enough, that then we could have a large enough market that the companies will negotiate with us too. As I've just mentioned, companies are.
Yeah, I think I like your we are a market, but what I think is we need to build up our pool of human resources, not only in terms of those directly involved in the sector, but also in terms of those who can do the analysis of the social implications and do the policy guidance. Yeah, absolutely. I see there are some questions.
Yeah, there's finally some questions, and we don't want to give up the floor, but we will. Please, Alice, come in.
Hello. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. Yeah, I'm very lucky to be able to pose some of my questions first. So the first one is this. Throughout this entire festival, what's been really lovely about the ethics and society stage is that we've seen the conversations move from something that's quite grandiose and quite high level into very specific, actionable tools, toolkits, and approaches for these problems. Is, like, just from my knowledge, and I am based in London, is this the same on the geopolitical stage, or would you say that in terms of the practitioner, we don't quite have the infrastructure yet to say that this is a practitioning space, or are we still at that kind of grand level? Like, and if there are some practitioners who are working in this geopolitical space when it comes to ethics, who are they? Apart from obviously yourselves, but who should we be looking at?
Hmm.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Joanna.
I was just going to say, the way I met Dorothy the first time was through the Global Partnership for AI. And that is trying to be both excluding of some, unfortunately, which I don't think is always a good idea, but certainly inclusive of the developing world. And so it's the G7 trying to look outwards and expand some of their contacts. So, but I also think that I am starting to see a lot of initiatives within the EU and Africa, like little things. I don't know if they're big enough yet, but at least they're starts. And so I am having more conversations with people from Africa. In fact, part of the reason I took the Berlin job was because I was invited twice to Africa in 2019 and couldn't make it just because the flight was too insane. so I wanted to be closer because it's so exciting to have a whole new number of people that are coming. They're getting more and more engaged.
Yeah, it's complicated, Alice. Let me say again that Africa is just so diverse. You could go to one part of the continent, one country, and you will find lots of people who are able to engage with you. And then you move to another part. We know, for example, within West Africa, the level of instability within the Sahel, the fallout from the non-regime, well, let me not comment on those things, but certain countries in North Africa are still in conflict, and that filters down to create instability. So in those kind of contexts, they're worried about survival, but they still have to worry about procuring certain systems. Because, for example, they're going to use an ID system that was not developed internally and is going to have to adjust to the way they name people, which is completely different from the way people get named in Europe, you know, and that has the potential to create so much confusion. You know, I was attending a meeting that was being hosted in Mali, and I was shocked to find that a whole population had been marginalized because of the way they had been asked to write their names. So the things that qualified them as an ethnic group had been eliminated, and not by purpose, deliberate malice. It was because a system was designed by people who had no understanding of the culture. And let me say that an urban African who perhaps went to school at a private school in the capital and then went to the US to get trained up to a PhD level, they may not necessarily have that much more cultural sensitivity than any other person coming out of school. So building in that fact that we have a whole new set of people that we need to train up, so that we can draw on their expertise in the design of these systems. And I quote ID because ID is so fundamental, you know, but there are many other systems that are being imported and which have the potential to cause huge problems if we don't take into account some of the realities on the ground.
If I could just give a quick factoid that is so critical to thinking about AI in this space, but in general, the problems. The linguistic diversity in Africa is greater than the rest of the world combined, right? It really, it is where we started as a species. There's so much going on there. It is so much richer. And so that's so much promise, but so much challenge if you're trying to do, you know, something algorithmic and cheap.
You know, it's funny because I was, one of the conferences I did last week was the conference for the World Conference of African Linguists. And we were talking specifically about that because what's happening at the moment with natural language processing is a lot of focus on data scientists and algorithms. And linguists are being marginalized, just normal linguists, let alone people who actually understand the culture. So, you know, you have a word and the semantics of it is very complex, you will lose that complexity, which is losing that culture, because the digital translation will become the norm. You know, it's such a complicated area. And so I have been encouraging African linguists to get more computational linguistics programs running within their faculties to talk about getting better collaboration between faculties of linguistics and faculties of computer science. So that doesn't require people from outside. That requires an internal awareness of what potential risks you could be running.
So what I'm hearing from you both is that there's a running theme on this stage, that there are so many humanities disciplines that have been ignored by computer science for a very long time, and we should definitely be adding to that list linguists, and also I'd say feels like international relations and understanding international relations from a political perspective. Like a lot of what you've been talking about reminds me of some work that Calypso Nicolaidis, who's based in Italy at the moment, has been doing in terms of democracies and democracies and what it means to govern lots of democracies like the EU, etc. So that's the first thing I'm hearing. The second thing I'm hearing is just...
And then governance. Don't forget governance.
And governance. And the second thing I'm hearing is that there is so much almost low-hanging fruits that can be done in this area, because it is at even more of an embryonic stage than perhaps other topics in AI ethics. You know, you think about fairness and transparency, for instance. So those are the two things that I've heard from you there.
If I could quickly correct you on
okay.
So I like the shape of your answer, but the details are important. And I wouldn't beat up on computer science for not paying attention to other disciplines. Every discipline is like modularity. Of course, people know their internal discipline. It isn't computer science that's the problem. It is people when they wind up in power. And right now, some of those people only have a one-year degree in computer science, then dropped out or something. And that is a problem. You've got to plug in, you've got to respect that government can help you, that the other disciplines can help you, that there is actually stuff you don't know that people have spent thousands of years thinking about. And it's worth going to talk to them. But don't just beat up on computer science, please. And in a way that's empowering them too much. It isn't just about computer science, and that's the point.
You know, I can tell you that I'm really happy that my first degree is in philosophy, because ethics touches everything, you know, and logic touches everything. And what I find is there are some disciplines that encourage people to think logically better than perhaps other disciplines. But for me, Joanna, let me say that I think that the problem is to do with the way we organize education and how we reward people with degrees. And we have to encourage a greater interdisciplinarity even at the bachelor's level. And this is something that traditionally has been one of the strengths of the US system, because it does force you to take these courses so that you have a broader knowledge. But we have to be dedicated to lifelong learning. You know, all of us are learning every day. Yeah.
No, it's definitely going to change. I have to say, yeah, I'm also glad I have a liberal arts degree. And in fact, in behavioral sciences, which was basically psychology. I realize we need to wrap up, but I just want to say this. The other thing I was also worried about is we're not talking just about, I don't mean to say only about ethics. Yes, the discipline of ethics is really interesting, but I hope that CogX is also on board with the shift to being concerned about human rights, not only because you know, human rights matters or something human-centered, but because it is already enshrined in law, that the UN has been working on this for 70 years, and we're not just talking about like every little company hires one philosopher. We're talking about actually that we need to get on board with being plugged into the legal system and working with governance to improve governance, so we can be in a well-regulated society that doesn't have outrageously powerful people making arbitrary decisions.
You said it perfectly, Joanna.
Thank you.
That's a great note to end on. So thank you so much to you both for what could have been a much longer conversation, I'm sure.
Well, so much to be said.
Yes, thank you so much for attending. We know that there were a couple of other questions in there, and yeah, thank you so much for your thoughts on this topic.